Brachim Habayim. Welcome to all our friends. My name is Wayne Firestone, and I'm your host for the American Israel Friendship League webinar series, which has doubled down during this most difficult period where people are really in anguish over the situation following October 7th. We've been running our program now twice a week to bring you people who have unique insights from what is happening at this really challenging moment. Today is no exception. We have a remarkable program for you that we hope will actually present some glimmers of hope, some visions of what maybe the future might look like. We are not going to try to just describe the present tense, but we are going to try to go a little bit deeper into what are the dynamics that are at play and really what are the possibilities of people who are seeking to change for the better what the situation is, even as there's so much uncertainty abounding. Now, I know this week for many was an opportunity to stand up and to be seen and to speak out on behalf of Israel in some unique ways. In particular, hundreds of thousands of people came to Washington, D.C. to be a part of that rally. I'd love to give an opportunity to anyone in the audience who either came to Washington, if you were there to protest, to be present, or if you've been able to do that in some of your own community. Not everybody was able to get on a plane. If you were in any way physically present and able to make yourself seen on behalf of Israel, I'd love for you to just put something into the chat so that people can recognize that. We know that today you've decided to be here with this amazing panel we have to go deeper, to learn more, and to be ambassadors on behalf of Israel at this really most challenging moment. I am super excited to have a friend and a colleague who has done so much for Israel over his entire life, a board member from the America-Israel Friendship League, Dr. David Milch, who really is a Renaissance man on many fronts. David was trained at Harvard Medical School. He's been involved in medical technologies that have benefited people all over the world. He's done a collaboration with Tel Aviv University on a cancer therapeutic venture. It would take me the whole program to describe all the different activities that he's involved in. I've got to know him through his foundation, the Dr. David Milch Foundation, which is committed to Tikkun Olam, to helping people around the world deal with various kinds of challenges at a personal and community level, educational programs and the like. When we wanted to create a program today that gave deep insight, not only from a Jewish and Israeli perspective, but also from a Palestinian perspective, David jumped on this because he recognized that the need for two narratives and people who live in conflict to be able to talk to one another, to be able to understand one another, to discuss with one another, and if necessary, cry and celebrate with one another, hopefully one day, inshallah, will happen. That has to be part of our mission as well. And so I'm going to turn over to David, who has personal relationships with both of our panelists. They're both really important people in the world that we're dealing with. David, go ahead and set the stage for us a little bit with why these two panelists at this moment for this discussion.
Well, Wayne, I'm going to get the replay and print out your introduction and read it to my sons. So it's not
and
just
your mom
and to my 92-year-old Holocaust survivor mother, who loves the AIFL and has attended. Thank you so much, Wayne, for the introduction and for all that you and the AIFL, American Israel Friendship League, does. I do want to take a moment to thank our chairman, Eric Gertler, our president, Jonathan Bar-Said, in Israel, Ambassador Dan Gillerman, chairman, and currently Daniela Rilov, our executive director, Ruby Shamir, recently executive director. I could go on, and Giovanni and Kim and Raquel and Bianca, and there are so many people that really, for 50 years, AIFL has done what it does. And this is a perfect example of the good work and rallying to try to make bridges. The name of this seminar is Can 1 + 1 = 3 during war? And I asked you, Wayne, explain what this is about. And he said, well, we have two gentlemen that are on with us here, two friends, Harley Lippman and Gaith Al-Omari. And can these two gentlemen, who come from at least objectively very different backgrounds, come together and create, I suppose, a new math? And I'm reminded of what my father, also a Holocaust survivor, used to say. He said, David, in Yiddish, 1 + 1 doesn't just equal 2, it can equal 11. It depends upon how you do that math. And it's not just a metaphor, it's really looking at how we think about this extraordinary set of circumstances that we're in. And you can't do that in a vacuum. The AIFL provides a platform, and the two gentlemen that I'm so proud to introduce here, first of all, my friend of 25 plus years, Harley Lippman. Your background, Harley, and what you've achieved is so wonderful. And all through that, maintaining friendship and connections to so many individuals. Your background in political science at Columbia University, Harvard University, your great achievements in the business world and the technology world with Genesis 10. And recently, for quite a while now, 5 or more years that I've certainly been following it, a commentator on the political scene, on the international geopolitical scene, on MSNBC and Fox. You're on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. And again, it speaks to trying to bring people together. And most recently, being appointed to MEPA, MEPPA. Want to make sure I get this right, the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which is the largest congressional commitment for building trust between Israel and Palestine ever. And as a good example of that, not too many years ago, 2 years ago or so, I was fortunate to be introduced to you, Gaith, Gaith Al-Omari, and to develop a friendship. And your background with the Middle East, with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a trained attorney, and specifically relevant to this discussion, your close connection with and hands-on involvement with the Palestinian Authority for 25 plus years, working with Mahmoud Abbas and other leaders in trying to bridge gaps, bring people together as an educator. And I must say, as Dad would said, David, ins Leben sei ein Mensch, be a human being, be a Mensch. And both you and Harley, you Gaith and you Harley, are Mensches, are human beings, and that's what we're here to discuss. Is there a new math? How do we approach this? What can we glean from your experience, and open it up for discussion with this group? So I turn it over to you, Harley, perhaps to start us off.
Well, thank you. And thank you, David. You know, David is a brainchild to bring this together. He's an extraordinary connector, and you can never overvalue how important that is. So yeah, you know, and so I want to thank David and Wayne for doing this. And Gaith, just so you know, my credentials, a neurotic Jewish guy from Long Island who grew up in a dysfunctional family. That's my credentials. Gaith, on the other hand, was hired by Yasser Arafat and worked under Mohammed Abbas. So he has higher credentials than I do. But nevertheless, that said, Gaith and I are good friends. I'm a Zionist and very much committed to it. Gaith is Palestinian and an advocate for two-state solution and a Palestine peacefully alongside Israel. And what I think is hopeful about all this is Gaith and I have a lot of things in common, and we've become good friends, but we could constructively disagree on an adult level and still keep a friendship and still believe in peace and the respect of human life. And I think both of us feel that whatever your grievance, you can't deliberately kill women and children and elderly. And I think that foundation is, I think, what brings us together. So I guess if I were to start it off, I think if Gaith's okay with this, I would start off with, why is October 7th significant? What does it mean? What does it say about the Israeli-Palestinian issue? What does it say about the Middle East and the world at large? So I will ask Gaith to make a few quick comments, and then I'd like to speak after that, if that's okay, Wayne.
Hey,
Sure.
please, yes.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much. I mean, thank you, David, for making the introductions. Thank you, Wayne, and the whole team for having me. And before I start, I should embarrass Harley. I mean, we've been talking about our professional credentials, etc. What we have not told you is that the real reason why Harley and I are friends is that we share one important commonality. We're both into heavy metal. And it's amazing when you disagree on every part of politics, how some headbanging can resolve it. But seriously, that aside, look, I'm not going to spend too much time on October 7th, and I think Harley, probably you can speak more about it. Ultimately, it is a trauma of the Jewish people, as we all know, the bloodiest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, etc. All I have to say about October 7th is that it is, anyone who will tell you that this is anything but terrorism, this person is either deluded or more likely malicious in that. There's no other way to describe October 7th except terrorism. I'm sure we will talk about grievances that Palestinians have. I am happy to criticize a lot of the Israeli government's policies, particularly this government. But at the end of the day, there is nothing that justifies killing civilians in their home intentionally. And anyone who does not condemn it need to check their moral compass when it comes to this. So that's the extent that I will talk about October 7th. I'm sure we're going to be talking about what are the policy implications, where do you go from here. But I think it's important to put this as a baseline. And I have to say one more thing, if I may. You will hear a lot, and I hear it. I go a lot on campuses with Jewish friends to model that we can have this kind of conversations, a lot of students. Kids sometimes ask me, did Hamas do it because of the occupation? Oh, of course, the occupation is not something that I would ever condone, and it does create radicalization. Yet, it's worth remembering that Hamas is not an organization that believes in peace. When I was a negotiator, I remember every time we made progress with the Israelis, Hamas will go blow up a bus, blow up a cafe, etc. So this is an organization that is intrinsically committed to terror, and anyone who says that they are trying to look for peace, I think, is, again, either ignorant or more likely malicious. With this, I'm going to hand it over back.
So I would say, I think, one, I want to start with, why is this so traumatic for Jews, and who's responsible? So one is, we all grew up thinking the baseline for evil is the Holocaust. And even though we know the theme never again, I don't think any of us really thought that we'd ever see anything like this. So it's extraordinary for us because, we kind of think the Holocaust is in black and white documentary footage, Schindler's List. We tend to think of it as history, past. And I think that the trauma means shock, is to find that it's alive and well, that the Holocaust may have gone into hibernation, but it never went away. I would call it Holocaust 2.0. And I never make reference of Holocaust comparison to some other crime, genocide, or evil, because it could somehow trivialize or diminish the Holocaust until October 7th. But there are some significant differences. One is that the Nazis hid their crimes. In this case, Hamas showed it off. They took video footage of it. They did what they did with pleasure and with glee. And that is extraordinary because on a personal basis, pound for pound, you can argue that this is worse than the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was really the industrial systematic elimination of a people as efficiently, as quickly as possible. I'm not minimizing the brutality or savagery or cruelty that occurred in the Holocaust. But in terms of personally torturing people, as Hamas did to Jews, slowly burning families alive and watching it, raping the daughters in front of the parents, killing babies, that rarely occurred among Nazis that would engage in that. Of course, it happened, but it was not policy, and it was not the norm. And in this case, it was a norm not only to savagely kill all Jews, but to go out of your way to torture them. I mean, I want to give one graphic example because I want to make sure this is never forgotten. Just to give, and there's a video footage of it, and it appeared on Hamas's website. where they took an Israeli woman who was pregnant, held her down, put tape over her mouth so they couldn't hear her screams for mercy or her screams of terror, and cut open her stomach, no anesthesia, pulled out her baby, and killed it, suffocated it in front of the mother. Just to give you an example, because you have to be specific. Otherwise, if you just use words like terrorism, or it doesn't convey, I think, how savage and brutal this is. Also,
Harley, if I'm going to interject here,
sure.
Everything you say is of course true, and everyone on the panel here, as well as I am confident everybody watching, we can stipulate to this the level of barbaric behavior, etc. What we want to do, as you well know, my friend, is to acknowledge this is the case. And now we are, whatever it is, 41 or 42 days since these horrific things happened. What is potentially the new math? How can we glean insight? In no way forgetting or minimizing. Let's try to move that forward, because we can easily spend many hours on the
Right. So let me jump into it. I think number one, I think, you know, we're losing, or we've lost the propaganda war, meaning who's responsible for this? You know, I think this is a critical part, because Israel is not anti-Palestinian. I'm pro-Palestinian. But what's extraordinary to me is in all the demonstrations, nobody's blaming Hamas. So I think David and Wayne and Gaith, I think it's really critical to point out that, you know, Hamas is anti-Palestinian. Why? They don't want a Palestinian nation. Gaith and I believe the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. Hamas wants a caliphate like ISIS. So that's reason one. Reason two is that even in a television interview in Moscow, one of the leaders of Hamas says, we have the tunnels for our fighters only, not for the Palestinian people, which speaks to the fact that Hamas does not care about the Palestinian people. The fact that they didn't build one air raid shelter in Gaza is extremely important, because it speaks to the fact that not only do they not care about the Palestinian people, they're exploiting them. It's remarkable. I don't think ever in history did we see a military using their civilians to protect them. In history, the military is used to protect civilians. So and lastly, I want to say that the Hamas leadership, the top three people, are worth $11 billion. $11 billion. Now, when people in Gaza are living in misery and poverty, just $1 billion in Gaza, you know, when probably the yearly income is something like $12,000, you know, would go an extraordinary way. And I just wanted to, I think that's important to point out, because these people are corrupt. They don't care about the Palestinian people. They're exploiting them, yet they're not really held to accountability. It would be, at best, we see things like, oh, yes, Harley, I condemn Hamas, but, and you can contextualize terror.
So Harley, everything you're saying, no one can push back and to disagree. In order to move it forward, Gaith,
so here we are, education. So let me start with that. So
Harley, hold on one second. Let's try to have a balanced conversation here. I know you so well, and you have so much information. I would like to ask you, Gaith, and I won't speak for you. I believe you agree with all of the important points that Harley's made on the barbarity. You said it in your opening remarks. However, there are voices on the other side. Just in the last day, or I think today, I circulated to our group this, and there's been many videos of Mossab Hassan Youssef, who's a son of one of the founders of Hamas, and is as vocal in condemning Hamas in terms of what they've done, how they victimized the Palestinian people. So this whole range of issues, without trying to whose suffering is greater or worse, how do you approach this from your perspective?
First of all, I mean, I actually want to echo what you just said, David. One thing that I found, to be honest, like both difficult to handle, but also satisfying is, yes, I mean, there is no denying that the majority of voices that I've heard coming from the Palestinians and the Arab people have been either supportive or excusing what Hamas did. And to my mind, this is something that we as Arabs, we have to deal with for our own, you know, for the sake of our own health as a society. if nothing else. Yet what I found very encouraging is that there are many Arab voices that have come out actually criticizing and condemning this. And less so, to my mind, less important, the voices like myself who are doing it from Washington or from the United States, even in the Arab world. We're seeing this in mainstream Arab media, etc. So I just want to point out that the individual you mentioned, Musab Hassan, is not the only one. There's a lot of mainstream voices doing this. We are a minority, but we're by no means non-existent. Now, but your question, how do you deal with this? I always like to think about, okay, what happened has happened. And as I was looking at the comments, no one's saying forget and forgive, because there's no forgiveness for this, and certainly no chance to forget. But the question is, how do you move forward? And as I look at it again, maybe as a Washington creature, I work in Washington. This is what I do. I see there are three sets of policy issues that we have to deal with and balance, and maybe have some trades-off with. The first one is certainly, based on everything that we just said, Israel has the right to defend itself. So how do you ensure that Israel actually achieves its objective of basically, as I understand it, making sure that Hamas can never again harm Israelis? This is, as I see it, as an objective, and this is a military objective and an achievable military objective. So that's one set of issues. The other set of issues, which is related in some ways, is how do you do this in a way that minimizes damage to civilians? This is, in my mind, both a moral imperative, but also a political imperative. At the end of the day, for Israel to be able to have the diplomatic space to achieve its military objectives, it has to demonstrate that it is mindful of civilians, both in terms of targeting and allowing humanitarian aid. At the end of the day, the U.S., which has, I think the Biden administration has done a good job in backing Israel. The U.S. needs to maintain an international front in support of Israel, and that can only be done if you can demonstrate that civilians are being protected. And finally, and maybe most importantly, maybe not today, but as we look forward, is how do you create a day after, not only to prevent Hamas from ever rearming and reconstituting, but start creating a new different model that can actually give some hope to the Palestinians, foster the kind of thinking that ultimately will allow us to get into some sort of a healthy conversation with Israel about how do we end this once and for all. Because what we have seen so far is that the status quo ante, what we had before, was inherently unstable, and it's really tragic at this that we had to kind of learn this lesson through such a tragic moment. So these are the three sets of issues. Not easy, none of them is easy, but I think none of them also is unsolvable.
Well, Harley, I'm gonna come. I want to pose it to you this way. So before October 7th, you were deeply involved in multiple levels with the Abraham Accords and traveling in the Middle East and the Gulf region and meeting with senior people involved in moving this forward. And then suddenly this is turned upside down, which I think we would all agree is part of the agenda of the puppet master of Iran and the geopolitical considerations there, which of course weigh in to the specifics that we're talking about here. Again, I know from your background, you are looking at these wide issues. And of course, as a proud Jew, you're so aggrieved, as I am, with what's happened in the specific. Go from the specific and the barbarity, and let's try to broaden this into what was going on before October 7th, and can we reinvigorate that math and move forward, as Gaith is suggesting, to the day after?
Well, I know you're eager to get to the day after, but I think it'll do a disservice if we didn't do, which I did at the beginning, was talk about, I think, who's responsible, because you have to, I think you need to lay that out. And I know you're kind of fast forwarding. But the second part, which I think would be a disservice to the listeners if we don't address it, is I think the anti-Semitism that has come about because of this. And I want to speak briefly on it, because I think it's very relevant to this. So, this is, I'm on radio a lot and television, and I get asked sometimes about this, the question of anti-Semitism. So here's my response. Are Jews saying anti-Semitism because we want to avoid criticism and it's a good way to shut down our opposition and we're being manipulative? That's what people who don't like Israel would suggest, if they're honest. Or are we speaking about anti-Semitism because it's real? Well, the way you know the answer is there a different standard applied to Israel versus other nations? And if there is, that's where you see it's anti-Semitism. So, and I'll tell you why. And so what is a different standard? One is, and Gaith alluded to it about civilians. Yes, Israel has to do everything possible to minimize casualties among civilians. But at the end of the day, and the Geneva Convention is quite clear, when you use a hospital or a school as a place to conduct violence against another group, you lose your protected status. The Geneva Convention also says the attacking country has to give warning to civilians and has to act proportionally. So they do puts limits and safeguards on Israel's actions. But when you use a hospital or somebody's balcony to fire a rocket into an Israeli home that kills a family, that becomes a legitimate target. Yet the world doesn't see it that way, by and large. And that's anti-Semitism. It's funny, anybody could win a war except for Jews in Israel. From 1947-48, they won that war. The victor dictates the terms to the losers. That's the history of the world, except when it comes to Israel. So I think, why is that important in all this? Because you want to get to the day after. Unless we address the double standard and anti-Semitism, we're never going to successfully get to the day after. And I think it's critical that we do. Now,
and Harley, you were doing that because anti-Semitism existed before October 7th. You were committing yourself to the Abraham Accords, Gaith in the Camp David and Taba with the Palestinian Authority. So there have been these efforts. Anti-Semitism is thousands of years old. Again, how do we begin to put these pieces together, knowing that there is...
Very, very simply, number one, even if you made peace today and you got rid of Hamas and you had a Palestine, it would not be sustainable. Why? Because I think the hatred in the Arab world, particularly the Palestinian world, and particularly under Hamas, is so great. I mean, think about it. There were thousands of Hamas fighters. And, and I'm sorry to say this, but, not all Palestinians are Hamas, but all of Hamas are Palestinians. And people are not born bad. They're not born to hatred. They're educated that way. And they're educated in Gaza to kill and hate Jews. So unless you stop that, and that speaks to the other issue, which we'll get into, is I think, how could this happen? Which I think speaks to arrogance. So I think, one, Israel let Hamas govern Gaza and teach the people their hatred, and Israel didn't do anything about it. And I think that was a colossal mistake on Israel's part. And I think that speaks to the last part before, the day after, which is where do we go from here? And how do we really make peace in the Middle East? And I think that there's only two ways that I see really going forward in terms of making peace. One is that speaks to how you really end wars and conflict. And I know what I'm going to say may sound very brutal, and I'm the first advocate for peace. But if you really want resolution, which speaks partly to what David and Gaith brought up, I think you need to say this. Why is it that 80 years later, neither Japan or Germany, for the last 80 years and now, through 4 generations in each country, they have no interest in war whatsoever? Germany and Japan are peace-loving nations. And yet, until 1945, they were considered the most warlike nations in the history of the world. People thought it's in their genes, in their blood. And if you kill more Japanese and Germans, you're only creating more fighters. Like, that's what people say. Israel's policy is backfiring. The more Hamas and Palestinians they kill, the more terrorist fighters they create. Well, what I'm about to say rejects that argument completely. Why is it that there's no appetite for war from Germany and Japan 80 years later? Why? Because we utterly and totally defeated them. And once you're defeated, you have closure. We bombed Tokyo one night. We killed 80,000 people. Brutal, terrible. And the United States and Britain was intentionally bombing civilians in Germany and Japan during World War II because they thought this would weaken morale and end the war earlier. Israel's not intentionally bombing civilians. They will send out leaflets and millions of robo-texts to residents in a building saying, leave, we need you to leave. This caused a lot of stress among Israeli generals saying all the Hamas fighters are going to leave with their weapons too. But Israel still does this, which again speaks to Israel's fighting the war with an exceptional level of honor and humanity, which is not being recognized. But again,
So Harley, of course, our mutual friend, and I'm sure many on this webinar, Daniel Pipes, has said the same thing for decades now. The only way to stop tyranny is to completely defeat it. But Daniel also says, as you have said, that bombs cannot defeat ideas. Bad ideas must be replaced by good ideas. And Gaith, maybe I'll ask you to pick up from here in terms of, from your perspective, what are the healthy ideas? As a physician, I'm always trying to get patients to embrace healthy ideas. Otherwise, they just keep bouncing back into the emergency room or the operating room. What are the healthy ideas that have a chance of getting hold, assuming that the tyranny, the barbarism is fully defeated, as Harley and I believe all of us understand what's happened, but simultaneously, how can we begin to embrace healthiest ideas? What does that process look like, Gaith, from your perspective?
If I may just maybe respond to a couple of points first. I mean, while I do agree that Hamas has to be completely defeated, and this is my approach to every terror organization, I think the idea of complete defeat when it comes to the Palestinian people is one that is purely impractical and unreal. The fact is, national identity can never be suppressed, and yes, you can militarily defeat, but the quest for self-determination should not be, would never be killed. And also with the idea, look, I mean, when it comes to anti-Semitism,
but that's the point, Gaith. One
yeah,
is the military defeat, so that they cannot send missiles.
But this is again.
The other is
what,
how do you change the ideas? How does
Yeah, but again, I mean, this is maybe relating to the next point that you said. But obviously, things like anti-Semitism has to be fought, and has to be fought very directly and relentlessly. Yet, when I look at how do you deal with problems, I don't think that you can deal with all of the problems at the same time. And I do believe that we can live with a better situation, even if you don't, dismiss or get rid of all of the bad ideas. And to give you two examples. It's one thought, but two examples. You look at the peace that Israel had with Egypt and with Jordan. Okay, with Egypt since 79, with Jordan since the mid-1990s. Read any Jordanian or Egyptian newspaper, you'll see there's a plenty of anti-Israel, plenty anti-Semitic, and as I said, it has to be addressed, and it's a multi-generational issue. Yet the two countries, Israel still has a stable peace with both Israel and with Egypt and Jordan. Why? Because you have governments and leadership there which are committed to the peace. So to my mind, as we look at what happens next and how do you develop ideas, first of all, definitely you have to defeat and destroy Hamas. That's a given. But also you have to start thinking of what kind of structures do we help and do we support coming up from within the Palestinian system. How can we create a reality that enables Palestinian leaders who are basically might not, certainly will not be Zionists, but people who are committed to a two-state solution, meaning a Palestinian state next to Israel, committed to fight terrorism, because I think that's a baseline that everyone has to commit to. And this may not relate to this audience, but certainly to me, it relates that how do you create a Palestinian leadership that is non-corrupt, that can govern in clean, effective ways to make them worthy of the respect of their own publics? To my mind, this is the baseline. I would love to see, eradication of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Certainly something that I have been involved in my kind of, other capacities. Yet, if we try to solve everything at the same time, I say we can't do it. So let's start with what we can achieve, accepting, again, these three baselines: defeat terrorism, accept the right of both peoples to have a nation of their own, and finally, as a Palestinian, I want my government ultimately to be one that is clean and that is representative.
If you would go a little further with this, a question just came up, which is so relevant. What is the role of the Quran and the religious teachings, which is a subject that is so broad, but specifically Bernard Lewis, what went wrong, so much of the thinking, and you were at the table with the leaders. You were at Camp David, you were at Taba, you yourself, I know some of the leadership really frustrated you. So you're seeing it from all dimensions. There isn't a separation of church and state, or mosque and state, generally speaking, in the Muslim world. And that is a fundamental difference between Judeo-Christian. But we're not going to solve those things in this webinar or quickly. So again, what are the practical things that enable us to get back on what Harley was doing so importantly? Abraham Accords, the things
Mhm.
which you at the Washington Institute think about, knowing that there's fragility, knowing that the Palestinian
Yeah.
Authority leadership is old and Hamas will be defeated. How do we put this together in a sense?
Um, First, actually, on this one, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because while, in Camp David and all of those, the Quran was never cited once, yet, as you rightly said, there was never true separation. But what we're seeing in the Arab world, and this kind of really links to your question, what we see in the Arab world right now is that political Islam, after the Arab Spring, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, has been so discredited that we are starting to see new models of governance and politics being established in the Arab world, and particularly in the Gulf. I look at the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and I know Harley is nodding his head because I know he spent a lot of time there. These are countries that basically said that the religion and politics can only produce bad things. Let's have a new model, a model that focuses on economic prosperity, a model that focuses on stability, on security. And as a result of this kind of thinking, something like the Abraham Accords became possible. So to my mind, how do you take that model? And, to be very specific, when I think of a day after, I think that, Hamas defeated, etc. The Palestinian Authority is too weak to govern Gaza. You have to bring an international presence, and the Arabs have to be very highly represented, and not the Arabs who are, Qatar that supports the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. No, bring me the Emiratis and the Saudis who can show that you can build a government that is focused on deliverables, etc. This is the model that I want to see happening. We tried it in the past. We tried it the end of the second intifada. In that time, we only had to rely on Europeans and Americans to do this, and there's a cultural dissonance. This time, if I can bring some of the Arab countries to kind of say, look, this is an authentic Arab model of good, clean government, one that is open to diversity. This is the one. So this is an opportunity here. And more than that, I will conclude with this point. This is not only a Gaza issue. For my mind, we cannot have a sustainable response until we start reforming the Palestinian Authority. So anything that happens the day after, I want to bring the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans and others to be part of this, because I want this model not only as a Palestinian, but as an Arab who I want to see this model flourish throughout the Arab world. So there is opportunities. By the way, none of this is easy, but these are all things which are possible today, but not have been possible 10 years ago.
You point to so many things. I'm going to go back to you, Harley. Arafat is no longer at the table. It's the son of King Hussein, who's now in Jordan. We have circumstances in Iran with the mullahs and their proxies and all of these things, which you're fully aware of, Harley, and which has been a background for what you have been doing on the Abraham. So again, I'm going to ask you to move past holding to blame and giving the statistics of the brutality. We stipulate to that. We accept it. Speak to what Gaith is saying. The countries, the leadership.
David,
How does one go ahead?
I will do it. I'll tell you what, I will honor your request completely. How about that? So
there
I
you
can
go.
be a little bit manageable. And there you go. And respectful to you. So I love what Gaith is saying. And that's partly why we're such great friends. And Gaith and I we forged a closer friendship when he stayed at my home over a weekend, and we got to know each other better. And I think, we're really aligned in how we want to make the world better in that part of the world. So what would be an example of fixing this and moving it forward? The example would be Saudi Arabia. So I learned this from Ali Shahabi, who's a thought leader in Saudi Arabia and close to the leadership. And he explained to me how Saudi Arabia got rid of Al-Qaeda there, which was a big challenge. He says, we reached out to the mothers. We went to them and said, if your children are looking at radical Islam on online or engaging in any activity, spending too much time at the mosque in ways that are beyond just religious prayer, that are destructive and radicalized, we go to the mothers and say, let us know. We'll take that person. We'll put him in rehab. We'll help him find a job. We'll even help him find a wife. When you do that, when you get involved and bring your community, they went to the mothers and they got rid of Al-Qaeda. They also were very tough and ruthless. So it was a carrot and a stick. And so if I remember his solution well, he feels that that's what Israel has to do. They have to get into Palestinian society, embrace the community. Mothers want their children to grow up and live a normal life and have children, and that you can be effective that way. That's one way. Second way is to look at Gaza as what Israel did with the PLO in 1982. The Israelis went into Lebanon, for those of you who may not remember, to get rid of the PLO. They pushed the PLO up north, and if you recall, the PLO left Lebanon and went to Tunis. So one solution is to say, let's get rid of the leadership of Hamas in Gaza, have them leave the country, what the top 2,000, 4,000, whatever it is. And this way you could have peace. The hostages have to be given back. You give the leaders of Hamas a way out, a ramp out, so that they won't be killed by the Israelis or have to be hiding in tunnels. And then Israel could follow up with retribution if they need to. They did it. They went after certain PLO leaders in Tunis anyway, but it got the PLO out of Lebanon. So those are two ways I would say that you may be able to have some type of solution. And I want to ask Gaith, if I may, what you thought about those two solutions. Gaith, does that make sense?
I'm gonna before you respond, Gaith. So this brings up so many important things, and I'll make this point. There are about 14 million Jews in the world. Interestingly enough, I looked it up. There are about 14 million Palestinians in the world. I didn't realize that. And when I lecture, I often make the point, if you look at the population of the earth, the number of Jews, the percentage, is about 0.2%. The percentage of Palestinians, since the numbers are about the same, 0.2%. It's a rounding error, the Palestinians and the Jews in the world together. However, the impact, because of the geopolitics, I'm going to come back to you, Harley, on this, because I know that you think in the broader context as well as you do, Gaith. So the Israel-Gaza, the Israel-Palestinian, the Jewish Palestinian and Middle East issue is in this larger context, as you've worked on, Harley, of the geopolitics of Iran and the big powers and what's going on today, the United States with two carrier groups in the water, what's happening in Russia. We're not going to be able to cover all of this, and China, but just take 5 minutes, Harley, because I think the audience here should get a taste of the kinds of things that you think about with your background, having worked, for example, with Solidarity, Lech Walesa, having worked in Southeast Asia. You really have a broad perspective, almost like Ian Bremmer or some others. And Gaith, after Harley speaks, if you would speak to this as well, from the perspective of a Washington Institute that looks in the larger context. Harley, if you would address the larger picture here.
I will. I just want to first say that it's interesting that you showed that Palestinians and Jews are the same number. You know, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that Palestinians are Jews, because when Islam
slept, we could go there. We could do
just DNA, an interesting anecdote.
We could do mitochondrial DNA with. This is my life. I'm using this as a metaphor. If we look up the numbers, it says approximately 14. Yes. The point is, it's a rounding error to the bigger world out there.
I know. Okay. I'm only saying it's tragic because they were forcibly converted into Islam. That's all. But as far as the bigger geopolitical picture, yes, thank you for bringing it up. Really, the head of the snake is Iran at the end of the day. Much more than Qatar, because even though you alluded to it, Gaith, I was against Qatar, but I've come to learn, I was at the embassy yesterday, and they showed me documents that cannot be published from the Israeli government. The Israeli government is culpable, and so is the United States government, and having Qatar as a middleman, funding Hamas so that they could get food and fuel and water and things like that. So yes, they support the Muslim Brotherhood. They also have the largest U.S. military base. It's a bit complicated, but in the big picture, Iran is the issue here, and that's really what this is all about. Why? Who's behind all this? Without Iran, Hamas couldn't have done this. Without Iran, Hezbollah wouldn't have precision-guided missiles aimed at Israel. So what is Iran all about? Now, what's important to note about Iran is Iran had nothing to do with the Holocaust whatsoever. Nothing. Yet they're the world center of Holocaust deniers. The world center. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? The only logical reason I could come up with is they want to minimize, if not eliminate, sympathy for Jews. And then you have to ask, well, why is that? I believe because they want to commit their own Holocaust. So if there is a lesson to come out of this, and this goes to the heart of one of the questions here, David, which is how could this happen? A lot of people are wondering. It's because when bad people say they're going to do things to Jews, we need to listen because they mean it. Even for America, our adversaries always tell us what they're going to do. So that's a powerful takeaway, because I think
Hitler wrote it in Mein Kampf, and my family suffered because of it. The history has proven that lesson. Harley, Gaith, if you would pick up from here on these larger geopolitical contexts, and I do want to respond to one comment. It's correct. 2 billion Muslims in the world, understood, Judeo-Christian, maybe comparable numbers. We're not trying to put numbers into this discussion to say greater or lesser or 1,400 killed, 10,000. The numbers just overwhelm us. What is the psycho-emotional, what is the geopolitical context of this? And the other parts, of course, are important. But in this discussion, Gaith, if you would address some of the things that are on the table now in the larger context.
I mean, okay, but first of all, maybe just a couple of quick comments. I mean, first of all, and I saw it in a question, I do not represent the Palestinian Authority. I have not been a PA official since 2006, and I only represent myself here. Yes, there might be 2 billion Muslims, but what do I care? My main identity is Palestinian, and I think this is something that people need to understand, that there's a Palestinian identity that is strong, unique, and cannot be subsumed under other identities. So this is this. Look, we look at the geopolitics, and here I have to agree with Harley. At the core of it, I think you look at this in a context where you have two sets of or a number of sets of competitions. One is the Iran. Iran is the source of so much of the region's instability, including what's happening in Palestine. Hamas is an organization that is supported by Iran militarily, financially, etc. But more than that, I would argue, Iran is trying to benefit from what's happening right now. And for Iran, and one of the reasons why I believe Hamas has to be defeated, because if Hamas is not defeated, then the message that we send to Iran and to its proxies and to every terror organization is you can commit such barbaric acts of terror and you'll get away with it. And that will just upend the whole approach that we have. And Iran, by the way, is not only, for this audience, obviously, you focus on how they are trying at threatening Israel. They're not only threatening Israel, they're attacking Saudi Arabia, they're attacking the United Arab Emirates, they've attacked them already. And even now, today, Jordan, a country that does not border Iran, that does not have any Shia in it, the Iranians have amassed a number of their proxy militias on the Jordan-Iraq border in order to destabilize Jordan. So all of this to tell you that Iran is one aspect of it. But I want to talk it back to another level as well. So the Iran is one level. The other level is there's also a split between those countries in the Arab world that are looking forward and those who are still stuck in the past. I'm being obviously reductionist here. For me, the countries that are looking to the futures are represented by the Abraham Accord countries. It's no coincidence that this attack happened at a time when we were in the process of a very vibrant, very robust Israeli-Saudi conversation to create this kind of a breakthrough, a new Abraham Accords, if you wish, because for those countries, be it countries like Iran, and here I would disagree with you, Harley, and I would say the Qataris play a negative role. These are countries that just do not want this new way of looking. So to my mind, again, defeating Hamas, not only defeating Hamas, ensuring that the day after we have a functioning, good governance system in Gaza is a way of strengthening already existing positive trends in the region. We're feeding into those and undermining the negative trends. Again, I'm not going to go into China, Russia, all of that, but I'm keeping it in the region. And I would say defeat Iran, undermine Iran, and at the same time support those voices. And I'm not talking about marginal voices. I'm talking about major countries that want to have a more stable, more interconnected Middle East, of which Israel is a part. And the day after in Gaza will play an important role in how we where the trajectory of the region will go.
So I want to put something on the table here. There's so many things to talk about. I wish we had many hours, but we're covering a lot of ground. We've talked about some of the challenges in the leadership within the Palestinians and in the greater Muslim world. We have some challenges, certainly, within the Jewish community, within the Israeli government. And certainly it's well known here that and this is not taking left or right sides, it's the issues of the protests in Kaplan. I was there personally, mind-boggling. Some friends on the right, let us say, said, oh, there's 10, 15,000. When I was there was at least 100, 150,000 in Kaplan and other protests. And many nuances here. But Harley, you are a student of the politics and how that relates to the economics. And there is a question on the table of, will shared prosperity be enough to ensure a peace process. History shows us that in general, countries that do business together don't make war, but that's not always the case. So maybe this question of the political dimension of this in Israel, how it plays, and the economic dimension, Harley.
Well, I would say going back, I agree with Gaith, that even if he's got a point that the notion of self-determination it will still be there, going back to my previous point of how you get closure. So that speaks to your question, David, that I think prosperity is not enough. It's important. Prosperity is good in that they will have something to lose. But we all know a lot of revolutionaries came from middle-class families, right? So, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, Lenin, I mean, they all came from middle-class families.
The 9/11 terrorists were from the middle class. Exactly.
Right. And Osama bin Laden came from a billionaire family. So you have to address ideology. And in fairness to the opposition to my point about closure, Japan and Germany had a nation. Palestinians don't have. So that's a fair point to say you have to deal with Palestinian self-determination, as my good friend Gaith pointed out, and I think he's quite right. I think that, though, going to your question, David, I think that the
political schism currently in the political tectonic plates, the frictions that we know are in Israel, how does that get managed and resolved?
Well, I think it ended up putting that aside for the moment, right? It united Israel like it's never been united before, even more than 47, 48, because you had the Irgun and Haganah clashing with each other.
It's existential. You have to be united, right, or it's existential.
That goes to the heart of also, like Gates says, why Israel has to defeat Hamas. He's absolutely right. The lesson can't be that you could savagely butcher people, rape them, take a 3-year-old as a hostage. And I need to be explicit so people know, I mean, a 3-year-old, and an 82-year-old grandmother. I mean, you have to do that. But there are other reasons why, you have to do that. And that is, it goes to the nature of why Israel exists as a country. Israel exists as a country to be a safe haven for Jews. If Jews don't destroy Hamas, what's the point of Israel? I mean, really? So they have to do it. I mean, the notion of never again will be meaningless. Now, the bigger question, I think, which was part of the agenda here, David, which is, how did this happen? Because everybody wonders, Israel, with its vaunted military and intelligence service, how could they not only be so surprised, but when they were surprised that the response time when Tel Aviv to Gaza is 1 hour.
A divided house will not stand. A divided house will find ways to collapse the walls, whether the metaphor is Solomon, but because we're not going to have too much time.
But I'll be quick, David. I want to, because I think it's real important that we address this. I'll do this in 2 minutes or less, if you don't mind. I think this happened because of arrogance, Israeli arrogance. Why our guard was let down. Obviously, Hamas is responsible.
Arrogance to ourselves.
Right. We're arrogant. Americans too. How do I define arrogance? When you think you know better what someone is saying, in this case, our adversary, than their own words. Believe them. It goes to the heart of what I said earlier. My last statement, I didn't get to complete it, is what are we waiting for with Iran? A nuclear bomb to hit Tel Aviv? They will try to destroy Israel. They will attack Israel. Believe them. Again, it's like Putin. He said he wanted those lands. Believe dictators. When they say they're going to do things, they do them. So why am I saying that? Is Israel, it happened because Israel was playing defense. Why? Because Israel thought that they're superior. This is what happens with arrogance. You violate basic rules of warfare. You underestimate your enemy. You hold them in contempt. This is what happens at its heart. And Israel was playing defense, and you can't win on defense. You have to go on offense.
But the obvious question is, what does offense look like? I'll give you another example of that on the other side. From my perspective, I would assume that the Hamas leadership felt, well, my God, we thought we'd get 1 or 2 hostages. We have 100, 140. They're not going to do anything. They're not going to touch it. Never would they imagine that the hard, tough decision is we're still going to go in. We're going to do what we have to do. The hostages are at risk. They are absolutely a priority. On both sides, there were assumptions that we're the most technological, we're the startup nation. A mouse can't get through our electronic wall. And lo and behold, a bulldozer and knocking down a communications tower. Suddenly, there was just a massacre. But again, we're not going to resolve the micro issues here. Wayne, maybe I'll turn to you because you've been listening to all of this. What are the things that you think about from the perspective of someone that looks at the AIFL level and as a thinker and a heartful person? What are the things that you believe are on the minds of our community that hasn't been brought up here?
Yeah, look, the AIFL for over 50 years has been about people-to-people connections. And I know, remember Harley telling me a story about bringing American vets to visit with Israeli vets and the impact that that had on a people-to-people level. And I think we recognize there are a lot of people who are suffering now. Children are suffering, mothers, fathers, grandparents. And I'm trying to think about, and Gaith, obviously the Palestinian people, this are seeing images that are terrifying for them as well. As you think about, we'll use this term the day after, and there have been several questions about how do we educate toward a common humanity? How do people see and interact with each other after a tragedy, after a trauma? Are there things that you have encountered that might be for either for younger people, if that will provide them some hope? Because we've heard from trauma experts in Israel that without hope, it's very hard to ask people to take risks. It's hard for people to, sleep through the night, let alone think about what's going to be better for their own kids.
Look, I unfortunately don't have much that is positive to say here. I mean, I unfortunately feel that after this war is over, the mutual enmity between the two peoples will be deepened. I know Israel very well, and I have never seen Israel in such trauma. And understandably, very understandably, what happened, the images, etc. That's how can you ever recover from this?
A pogrom in the 21st century.
I mean, it's unthinkable. And at the same time, the images that we're seeing coming out of Gaza, we can sit here and have a policy conversation for most Arab audiences, not only Palestinians. What they're seeing is basically dead babies. Sorry to say it this way. So I'm in the short term, I'm actually pessimistic, and I believe that today we need more of separation than anything else. That said, I would add two things, not to leave everyone on a very kind of depressed note. First of all, I do know that even as we speak today, there are Israelis and Palestinians who are actually trying to find ways of engaging one another. And I think it behooves us all to identify these individuals and see how we can help them. And I'm not talking about, dreamers who are so Pollyannish as not to understand the reality, but people who understand the difficulty right now, whether it is former military types, etc. So that's kind of one. And two, and this is where I actually think, again, I do see some hope, is that, we talked about the issue of education. And again, I repeat what I said earlier. I don't see it as a precondition for anything. For me, a cold peace that continues to have hatred, as long as we're not shooting at one another, that's better than we have right now. Okay? Maybe the bar is so low, but for me, that's good enough. Yet, it doesn't mean that we do not abandon the issue of how do you deal with education. And this is, again, where I find myself more hopeful as I zoom out and look at the Arab world. Again, I really urge people to go to the United Arab Emirates and go to what they call the Abrahamic house, where you have three: a church, a mosque, and a synagogue. They're the same spot, the same size, none is bigger than the other. Go and look at the shifts in the Saudi educational system. There is a trend going in the region right now. And to the extent that we can reward and encourage this kind of trend, to the extent that we in the United States, and here I think we're very important, we are the United States. Everyone not only looks up to us, everyone needs us. And so to the extent that we can message that we are supportive and rewarding this kind of societal shifts, the more that we can actually encourage and strengthen this kind of position. And that's why, and I can't remember if I said it now, but if in case I did, I'm sorry if I repeat it, but that's why what I want in this kind of administration that will come in Gaza after the war, that's why I don't want the Qataris. That's why I want the Emiratis and the Saudis, because what you're doing right now is you are creating something new. You have an opportunity to start, we have an opportunity to start with putting up a different educational thing, understanding that education is generational and understanding that it will take a long time to get to that point. But I think one can work on parallel tracks to do what is possible now while not losing sight of what is desirable in the long term.
Let me add something here. I was thinking about this discussion, which we're going to close out here, to the point you're making. And I think what also needs to be part of the table is the L word. And what I'm speaking to is, it's the 75th anniversary of the founding of Israel. Not too many years before, there was a Holocaust. Both my parents' family were decimated there. On November 22nd, 1963, I was 9 years old. And even as a 9-year-old, the assassination of the President of the United States was traumatic, and couldn't imagine, even as a 9-year-old, that this was something that we could get out beyond. Not even 3 months later, on February 9th, 1964, the Beatles landed at Idlewild Airport, went on the Ed Sullivan Show, changed our world. The L word could be love, but the real L word, I would say, for this discussion is leadership. There must be leadership. We must, Abu Mazen, Bibi Netanyahu, Joe Biden, Trump, all of this gerontocracy of leadership, unfortunately, is not adequate. No finger pointing to any of them in any specifics. There needs to be a leadership that is able to meet these kinds of challenges and to take this kind of discussion and really focus in on the moving pieces, as well as have a broader vision. And without that, we're just, we're wandering blindly. Go ahead.
Jump in. I want to say I couldn't agree with Gaith more. And the model of looking at the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia is exactly the right way. And it explains also what happened, that there are two groups in the Arab world. I'll call them the modernists and the fundamentalists. The modernists are the group that Gaith identified, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. The fundamentalists is Iran, Lebanon, Gaza. And if you look at the fundamentalists, they're failed nations. People live in poverty. People are miserable. And they can't tolerate the modernists because they see that their people are going to say, wait a minute, isn't that a better place to be in UAE, Saudi Arabia? People have a better standard of living, better education, security, all the things that we want for our families. And I do think also, I want to align with Gaith, even though I pointed out many of the distinctions of what Hamas did. At the same time, my hope is that the people of Gaza are tired of being bombed by Israelis. At the end of the day, are tired of what Hamas has brought them, are going to look at this and say, where did it get us? Where did Hamas get us after they committed their acts on October 7th? And that therefore they would be motivated and moved to want to have a different leadership. That's my hope. And
exactly. Failed leadership must give way. It must do something.
I'm gonna have, gentlemen, I'm gonna have to jump in there on a point of agreement of all three of you. I think
we can't extend for another half hour, Wayne.
Well, here's I'm gonna throw out a carrot. If we can do the heavy metal concert when we get to the day after, you guys get credit for seeding that vision of what the celebration could and should look like one day. We'll look forward to seeing what you're wearing for that particular episode. In all seriousness, gentlemen, you have brought both vision and perspective to an extremely difficult conversation. We needed David as a healer to remind us that we're all patients at the moment, and that we will need to find a way to get to that day after. We know we're not there yet. We know there's a lot in front of us, but as I think both of you said earlier, just modeling our ability to come together in conversation, whether it's on Zoom or in person, on college campuses. Gaith, I know you referenced earlier your visits. This is actually our next topic of discussion this Sunday, the 19th, on our webinar series. We'll be hearing perspectives from a number of Israelis who are currently on campuses right now and navigating this in real time. They happen to come from science backgrounds, so it's not necessarily science and business and other things. They're not political scientists, but yet they find themselves amidst really challenging environments since October 7th. So I know there were some questions that we didn't get to in this particular episode that actually related to the campus situation. We hope those of you interested in that.
I'm already going to
as
volunteer
broader
Harley
issues.
and Gaith to come back for a second session. Thank you, Wayne. Thank
Absolutely.
you, the American Israel Friendship League. Thank you, Gaith Al-Omari, and thank you, Harley Lippman. And most importantly, thank you all for attending and listening and being part of this dialogue.